welcome to the 88th episode of Fruity Knitting. I'm Andrea.
And I'm Andrew.
And we've got a really full program for you today, which we hope you'll really enjoy. While we were in Shetland, I interviewed Esther Rutter about her recently published book, This Golden Fleece. So Esther spent a year travelling around the UK to write this book, which shows how wool and knitting have deeply influenced the British landscape, the culture, and even to a certain degree, the English language. So the book is just filled with history, which I totally love, but also in parallel, it's Esther's personal knitting diary because she knitted a series of traditional garments like traditional socks and gloves and a gansey and a hat so that she could personally experience this history that she was researching and writing about. Now, Esther herself is very charming and very enthusiastic. So I think apart from just learning lots of new things about the history of knitting, you'll really enjoy meeting her during the interview and hearing about her process of writing the book.
Yeah, that's true. It's a really fun interview, that one. Carol Feller is also joining us. She's going to be showing you the beautiful designs from her latest collaboration called Cozy Knits. We're announcing the winners of the Fruity New Techniques Cow, which is really great. Andrea's got a short tutorial for us. We've got some stunning footage from the spectacular landscape in Shetland in our extreme knitting segment. That's a bit of an adventure. But I am really pleased to say that we're starting with me today in Bring and Brag with my completed cardigan.
Yeah.
So Andrea is modelling for me, but you are going to have to take it off after the show because this is actually for our daughter Madeline. It's the Celine cardigan by Michelle Wong, and I've knitted it in the Devonia DK by John Arbon Textiles. The Devonia is a really beautiful mix of long wool sheep breeds in a worsted spun yarn. So it's actually quite soft, and you've now done a full wet block. Mm-hmm. So the yarn's really bloomed out, and I think it's really beautiful. You say it's very snuggly.
Yeah.
You've also done your vigorous rub test.
Oh, yes.
To check for pilling, and it's showing no signs of pilling, so it's really a good yarn.
None at all. I can totally recommend this. It doesn't even feel like a worsted spun long wool, which sometimes can feel a little bit hard. It's really squishy and cozy, but the long wool does give it that extra sort of shine. It's beautiful.
Yeah. I'm really pleased with the result. If you're a regular viewer, you'll know I've been working on this for many episodes. It does have the all-over cabling, which slows me down. I was pretty satisfied with how I managed that. The first direction is certainly much easier, and it does slow me down as far as knitting stocking stitch to compare, but it was manageable. The other direction, which is only 1/4 of the body, is much more difficult and much slower for me, but I also got through that, and I think it's come up with a really neat and professional finish.
Yeah, there's cabling on the back. You did a fantastic job. If you look closely, it just looks very perfect. The tension, everything is really gorgeous. So I know some people have a bit of a joke at how slow you knit, but if you can come up with a garment like this, really, who cares? It's just beautiful.
Yep.
You can't tell that it's not knitted by an expert knitter. You really can't.
It's good as a bought one, is what my friend would say. Madeline was here a week or two ago, and she tried it on, and at that stage it was missing one sleeve and it didn't have the button band, but still it was really clear that it fitted perfectly, and she certainly loved it, so it's really good.
It's her 21st birthday.
That's right.
And this is your present to her.
Yeah. So you've bought the buttons just to finish it off. You went and bought these leather buttons, which I think are really cool. I think they sort of suit the sort of traditional look of the cardigan, unisex kind of thing. Yeah. And obviously they go with the colour. And yes, this is my birthday present to Madeline for her 21st birthday. Whilst we mention that, I do want to mention it was my 50th birthday, and I have to say a very big thank you to everyone who said their birthday greetings to me. That was really touching.
It was wonderful.
Touching.
I really enjoyed reading through all of his comments.
We read through all of them. And
you've never had so many birthday wishes in your life.
Definitely not. So thank you very much to everyone for that.
Yeah, that was great.
Yep.
Yeah, so Madeline is going to totally love this from her dad for her 21st. I think it's a fantastic present.
Yep.
And I've actually done a tutorial on this project. Since I was going to teach Andrew anyway, I thought I'd show you how I normally work my buttonholes and sew on my buttons. Now, I know a lot of you are very confident in doing this, but some viewers have expressed that they've been a little less than satisfied with the results they're getting. So hopefully for those viewers, it might give you a bit more confidence.
Yeah. Before we go into the tutorial, I just want to tell you quickly about my next project.
Yeah.
In the last episode, I did mention that I was really impressed with the bird's eye scarf that Lauren Anderson had knitted. So it's a lace scarf. Andrea's taken that on as my next challenge. This is going to be pretty interesting. We've got this yarn. This is a yarn that we picked up at Edinburgh Yarn Festival a couple of years ago. It's from Lammermuir Wool, which is a Scottish farm, and they say it's a Shetland lace weight single in a natural cream colour. And they say on the band, which has disappeared, no dips, no dyes, contains lanolin.
Yeah.
That's just what it feels like. I did also read about this farm. They actually shear half of their sheep by hand, using hand shears, which is really incredible. I'd love to see that. After that, they say they're too tired and they get the professionals in.
I can imagine
which is
that.
pretty funny. I am jumping in the deep end here a little bit. I'm doing the bird's eye pattern, and Lauren mentioned this in her segment, and I did look it up in this book. The bird's eye pattern is quite difficult. Some lace patterns have lace on one side and then they just knit back on the other side, or you might purl back. And to me, mentally, that's a really good thing because you get a little break, and I need a little break with my knitting. But there's no break with the bird's eye pattern. I'm actually working from this book here called Heirloom Knitting, and it's by Sharon Miller.
Yeah.
She ranks all of the patterns that she's got written up here in terms of experience required. And I think she starts at 2 stars and goes up to 5.
And this is?
The one I'm starting my lace knitting with is 5 stars. So it's going to be pretty interesting to see what I've got to show in 2 weeks' time. I am managing to read the chart okay. That is sort of okay. There's one challenge there, and that is the symbols mean one thing in one direction, and some of them mean they depends on the context as to what the symbols mean. So that's a little trick. I started off using stitch markers to help me keep going. It helped keep track of where I am, and this is one of them. This is a cashmere stitch mark.
It's a very exotic one, handmade.
Yeah, handmade cashmere stitch marker. So I put one of these in. It's just a loop of wool. I put one in at the beginning of each repeat, and that really helped me see where I am and make sure that, you know, if I've got 3 stitches to go, that's what I'm expecting. That worked well for, I think, 2 rows. And then after that, I think I had to borrow a stitch from the repeat after to finish my current stitch. And what actually happened was I ended up knitting the stitch marker into my work. So
We had to pull them all out.
I just had to rip them out. They were, so I broke them. So that's not working anymore. So I think the key to doing this is going to be, and this is a challenge for me, is to learn to read my knitting, both underneath and also what I've been doing before. Because I think if you just knitted through without any distractions, it would be okay. But you always have distractions, and then you stop, and then you have to go back and you have to know where you are.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's
there is a little bit of method in my madness of chucking Andrew in the deep end. It is fun. You need a bit of excitement in your life, and this certainly does it. I've never knitted the bird's eye pattern, so I'm living vicariously through Andrew. But if you look at the chart, and Andrew has no problems reading charts, your brain does that no problem. But there's only 3 symbols, and like you said, one of them means different things depending on where it's placed. So that is a given that is somewhat confusing. But apart from that, it's only a 6-stitch repeat. And the big challenge for you, like you said, is to read your knitting, which you normally don't do very well at all. So that's something like, you don't have to do the whole thing. Even if you just end up doing a swatch, and if it ends up too difficult, you can do an easier pattern.
Yep.
But your knitting will really improve because he'll have to do 6 stitches and then go back and see if he can read and analyse what he's done and understand it. So that in itself, whether you have much to show next episode or not, is just worth $1 million, I reckon.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing. So actually, as incredible as this may be, I'm going to work even more slowly than normal.
Okay, so coming up now is this tutorial, and straight after that we're going to take you on a stunning hike to St. Ninian's Isle. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I work my buttonholes and sew on my buttons. This project is the Celine cardigan by Michelle Wong, and it's a Brooklyn Tweed publication. So often buttonholes are worked over 2 rows. In the first row, you bind off a certain amount of stitches, and on the following row, you cast on the equal number of stitches above the bound off ones. Barbara Walker has a technique called the 1-row buttonhole, which can be worked on any stitch pattern and can also be worked on either a right side or a wrong side row. And this pattern here also recommends using the 1-row buttonhole technique. It's a really neat method, so I'll show you how to do it. Most buttonholes need to be a little bit smaller than the width of the button that you've chosen. Knitted buttonholes stretch, so it's better to have to force the button through a little bit at the beginning before the garment actually stretches over time. The placement of the buttonholes is also important. If you put your buttonholes closer to the body edge of the band than the outside edge of the band, it'll be much sturdier and the band won't pull out of shape and gape so much, especially after time with wear. So my band here is knitted outwards and it'll have 11 rows on it, and I'm going to work my buttonholes on the 5th row so that it's slightly closer to the body edge than it will be to the outside edge of the band. So this 1-row buttonhole method tends to look the neatest on the wrong side of the fabric. So I'll work my buttonholes on the wrong side row so that the neat side will be on the right side of the fabric. And I've placed markers here where the buttonholes will be made, and I need to have 5 buttonholes, and each hole will be 3 or 4 stitches wide, and there's about 15 stitches in between each buttonhole. So first of all, you work to the position in the row where the buttonhole should begin, and then you bring your yarn forward to the front of the work like this, and you slip 1 stitch purlwise from the left hand needle to the right hand needle, and then I bring my yarn through between the 2 needles to the back of the work again and slip 1 more stitch onto the right hand needle purlwise. Now I need to cast off 3 stitches for my buttonhole, so I start by taking that first slip stitch and passing it over the second slip stitch. That's 1 cast off stitch, and then I repeat this process for however many stitches I need to cast off. So I've slipped that one across and I slip that one off. So I've cast off 2 now. I get rid of my marker. And 1 more. So that's the process of casting off the stitches. And I put this final stitch on my right hand needle back onto the left hand needle, and I'm passing my stitches back and forth, always purlwise. Now I turn my work right around to the other side, and I pick up my yarn from where I'd left it hanging, and I bring it through between the 2 needles again to the other side of the work, and I need to cast on however many stitches I cast off plus 1. So I cast off 3 stitches, I need to cast on 4 stitches, and I'll do that by using the cable cast on method. So that means I take my right hand needle point and I pass it through in between the first and the second stitches on my left hand needle like that, and I wrap it and I bring the loop back, and I can either twist it and put it on the needle that way or just slip it like that. I think that looks neater, so I'm going to do it like that. So that's 1 stitch, and I need to do 3 more. That's 2. Now I turn my work back around to where I started. I bring my yarn between the needles and back to the other side of the work again, and I slip 1 more stitch from the left hand needle onto the right hand needle, and that last cast on stitch, that extra cast on stitch, I now slip it over that stitch there. So I've got the correct number of stitches on again. I cast off 3 and I cast on 3. That's all the process is, and then you just keep knitting until you come to the next place where the buttonhole should be. I've now finished the 11 rows of the button band, and here's the buttonhole here, just a very neat little slit. Now it's time to sew on these buttons, and just a little tip, make sure that the buttons you choose can be cleaned in the same way as the garment. So many people sew on their buttons with the same yarn that they knitted the garment in, and if the yarn's too thick, they separate the plies and sew the buttons on with, say, 1 or 2 plies. But I think if you separate the plies, the yarn can become very weak and break easily. Therefore, I always just use sewing thread because it comes in so many different colours, and so it's very easy to find a match. Now, I've never had this problem, but some people are concerned that a polyester sewing thread will cut through the fibres of a woolen spun yarn. If you are worried about that, just try not to splice through the yarn when you're sewing on the button, but instead sew around the whole threads of yarn. Next, I've lined up the 2 button bands and marked exactly where the 5 buttons are going to go, and I've sewn on my very first button. I'm using a small sharp hand sewing needle with a tiny eye. You have to make sure that it can fit through a buttonhole very easily. And I've got my thread double and I've got a little knot at the end of it. So before I sew on the button, I need to really make sure that my thread is really attached well to the button band. And I just go in under a couple of stitches of yarn and then back through that loop that is created because it's a double thread with a knot at the end. Just going to do that a couple of times. Okay, so now that's really solid. The next step is to sew this on as uniformly as possible so that it matches the previous button that you've sewn on. Now you can do it like I've done in an equal sign or a crisscross. I do each of these little strands about 5 or 6 times, so it's pretty secure. When you've done that enough, you turn it over and again go through 2 stitches completely. Try not to just splice little bits of the stitch, and you can do a knot. So I put my needle back through the loop that I've created, and I might do that about 4 or 5 times. And then I thread it through the thick bit and do that a couple more times and cut it off. So all my buttons are now sewn on. If you're knitting a very chunky knit and it's a cardigan and you're using a button like this that doesn't have a shank and you would like to have more space between the button band and the underneath of the button, you can create your own shank. So this is how you do it. What you would do is take something like either a pin or a small needle and lay it across the top of your button and then sew over the top of that, and that'll give you very loose stitches. Once you've done that, you pull your button up and then you wrap your thread around underneath, and that'll make that a very solid shank. So the buttons are all sewn on now and they're very secure, so they should stay well put for the whole life of the garment.
welcome back. The music that you've been hearing is called Une barque sur l'océan, which is translated to A Boat on the Ocean. It's by Maurice Ravel, written around 1905. As the name suggests, the music is imitating the flow of the ocean currents and the movements of the waves, whether they're gently lapping against the boat or crashing into it. And I thought that music really suited that scenery very well.
Yeah, it's beautiful, beautiful music. But that beautiful, peaceful, serene footage you just saw is really deceptive, because actually while that footage was being taken, both Andrew and I were terrified. We'd sent the drone out. We were on the island and we'd sent the drone out, and it was going to do a panoramic shot of the island, and we hadn't quite noticed this, but it was actually drifting out to sea because it was a strong headwind and it couldn't hold its position. When we finally did realize this, the battery was pretty low, and when the battery's low, you've got to act fast. Yeah. And so we sort of turned it around and just tried to drive it as fast as we could back onto dry land so that we could land it. And the headwind was so strong that it wasn't moving anywhere forward. It was actually still drifting backwards. So we started to get really scared. Well, at least I did. And so you have to think fast when this happens, especially when the battery is low. So then I thought, okay, let's pull it down so it's not quite so high and perhaps the wind is not so strong. And then let's try to do it on an angle. And that seemed to work. We eventually got it over dry land again, and we could see the landmarks. We put the camera down to see what's the landmarks of where we are on the dry land, and I noticed something that I could actually see with my own eye across the sea. So I thought, okay, it's in that vicinity, so we're sort of okay. And we almost landed it, and then the stupid thing decided it was going to go on autopilot because its battery was low and take itself home.
Which means back to us.
Yeah, and we could see this later on when we saw the footage. You see it almost land perfectly, and then it turns around and takes off again. And so it's heading out to sea again, and we're thinking, oh my God, that's disastrous, because we've got this insurance on our drone that if we crash it, we can actually bring back a crashed drone and for a small fee get a replacement. But obviously if you lose it, like if it just disappears out in the oceans, we can't do that. So the very best thing you can do is at least crash your drone and return it. So I'm sort of really panicking. I said, Andrew, just do something. So eventually he figured out how to get the autopilot off, and we sort of turned it around, got it back over the land again, and landed it. We didn't know if it was, because by that time the camera had gone, so we couldn't see where it was exactly. So we don't know if it's crash landed or what state it was going to be in. But we were fairly confident that it was in a certain area. So we rush across and we think, okay, even if we have to look for it for 2 or 3 hours, as long as we find that crashed drone, we haven't lost too much. It only took us about 15 minutes to find it, really. Yeah. And it had landed absolutely perfectly on a soft tuft of grass. Yeah. So not only did we get a perfectly drone that we could have reflown immediately if we changed the battery, but also all the footage was there. So all's well that ends well.
Yeah, a little bit dramatic getting there, though.
So I'm going to give you an update on my project, which I'm sort of a little embarrassed to say really hasn't changed since the last episode. And that's because actually last night I unripped about this much. I thought of photographing it for you just to prove that I have done it. But I'll tell you the story in just a second. This project is the Morning Star bridal jacket by the Danish designer Crystal Seyfarth, and it's based on a traditional Danish bridal costume that was worn on the Danish island of Færø. And the pattern comes from her book, Færø Strik Beyond the Horizon. And this book, by the way, is in Danish and English parallel. And the yarn I'm using is Crystal's very own lamb's wool yarn, which is a really lovely, they've got fantastic colours. And what's interesting about this yarn, if you've never knitted with this kind of wool before, it still has a spinning oil on it. So what's exciting is that when you finished your project, you wash it, and the yarn really changes. It softens out and blooms a lot more. So that's kind of something exciting to look forward to. Okay, so last episode I talked about putting in pivot stitches at the sides of the garment, and that's because the garment is the bodice is very fitted, so it's slim at the waist, and then it goes out like this up towards the chest, and you have to put in increases. And obviously on an all over Fair Isle pattern, when you're putting in increases, those stitches do disrupt the flow of an all over pattern. So one way is to work with pivot stitches. What I've done in the end, I've did a bit of trial and error with that as well, and then kind of changed my mind. You can see that this pattern is just a really broad lattice Fair Isle pattern all over. So what I've done is just simply had the pattern straight up the front and straight up on the back, and then I've decided to work all of my increased stitches only in the background light blue colour. So in a sense, under the arms, you'll have sort of like a V forming. And I think that'll actually be a good design feature, because it is meant to be, it's inspired by a traditional costume. So it's very similar to those sort of corseted bodices that really make the waist look small and the bust look big, and having that kind of V on the sides gives you that shaping as well. So that's what I've decided to do there. And there it is on the other side. And I'm pretty happy with that. I think it's going to work well. Now, the other thing is that my gauge has changed just very slightly from my original swatch, and that can happen. But what I do always when I'm knitting a project is periodically remeasure my gauge and just make sure that nothing too drastic has happened. And it also gives you the opportunity to do minor changes, like maybe do a few more increases or do a few less increases, or even go up or down 1/4 millimetre. And so you've got an option to do that without having to unrip all your knitting. I didn't unrip my knitting because of that reason. What happened for me is this is meant to be very fitted. So it's very fitted around the waist, and that was going well. But then I was worried that it wasn't going to be big enough across the chest. So I really I did a lot of increases, and then it was fitting very well around here because I'd knitted it up to about here, and it was looking really good. And then I realized that actually the bodice isn't meant to fit you. It's meant to be a minimum of 8 centimeters too small. And the reason is this is a jacket. So you're going to cut it up the middle here, where these are my sticking stitches, and it'll have 2 clasps down here and 1 clasp up here, and the section across the chest is meant to gape wide open. And what goes underneath that gape is another insert piece of material that's in a contrasting colourway and a contrasting Fair Isle pattern, and that sort of gives it that really traditional kind of costume look.
Yep.
So and mine, the way I'd knitted it, would have only gaped like minimal like this. And I thought, if I'm going to knit this really gorgeous traditional garment, then I want the full gaping effect.
Yeah. If you do too little, it's going to look like it was a mistake.
Or else I don't have a big enough chest,
Yeah.
and I'd have to put on a massive wonder bra to try to get the full effect.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I thought, no, I'm going to rip it out. So, because, yeah, I'm looking forward to getting that really gapey look and sticking a contrasting insert inside. I think if you're going to do an unusual design, then you want to do it with the full dramatic effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there we go. Hopefully you will see more next episode. So it's now time to announce the winners of the new technique, Carl. I totally loved this, Carl, and I think this is a Carl we definitely have to do again.
Yep.
The purpose of this, Carl, was to give knitters a lot of practice in a technique that was going to be completely new to them and one that they would find normally very, very challenging. So they had to do a large project, like a large garment, a large shawl, or even a blanket, and that would give them a ton of repetitive practice on this new technique to them, because really what you need to do with a new technique is do it thousands of times to get it into muscle memory and to get it into your subconscious, and then it never leaves you. And it takes your knitting to a completely new level. So it was so inspiring to see so many knitters just jumping in the deep end with their knitting and trying something that was really scary for them. And then at the end, being really excited because they actually achieved it.
Yep.
You know, that's super fun. So there was 45 projects finished in the finished objects thread, and people were trying all different kinds of techniques. Some were doing lace for the first time, brioche, double knitting, Fair Isle, combinations of Fair Isle and Intarsia. Some people who were English throwers were teaching themselves to knit in the opposite manner, which is continental, and they'd do a big project on continental knitting. So many new skills have been learned, and that's really, really exciting to see. And so many fantastic projects coming out of it. So we have 2 winners. Yay! But before we announce those 2 winners, there's 3 projects that I want to show you that are really worthy of honourable mentions. In fact, the whole 45 projects are very worthy of honourable mentions, but you'll appreciate that we can't show all 45 projects. So first off is entry number 29, Intended Knitter, and she tackled her first ever all-over Fair Isle project, and her project is Midsummer Meadow by Mary Henderson. And she writes that a year ago she was drooling all over the trendy colourwork yoke sweaters thinking that she'll never master the technique. And now she's happily planning on knitting all of them with confidence. So good on you and well done. That's fantastic. And I just love the roses that she's holding, that they match with her beautiful sweater. So next is entry 14, Jo Bertha Crafty, and Jo's scary new technique was lace work and working with lace weight yarns. And Jo knitted this very fine vest called Skylar by Louisa Harding, and it looks like she's also used Louisa's wonderful 100% cashmere yarn that I've just finished knitting with. Jo, your work looks really amazing. It looks so neat and elegant, so well done. And this one is entry number 2, who's Vivian NVS. And Vivian learnt the technique of knitting and purling backwards. So she could do all of the short rows in this really lovely shawl, which is called Impervious, and it's a design by Kim McBrien Evans. Okay, so now for the winners. Yay! The first winner is entry number 25, who's Tugdoor. Becca knitted Lindisfarne by Lucy Haig, and we interviewed Lucy Haig back in episode 62. She's an amazing talent, and many of her designs are based on Celtic and Pictish knotwork, and she uses quite advanced cable knitting techniques that allow you to create 2-sided cables. Anyway, slip stitch and mosaic work was the new technique for Becca, and she says that the over dyeing of the yarn that she also did for the very first time was actually scarier than the knitting. So congratulations, Becca, that is really fantastic. Now the next winner you will all be cheering madly for because of the immense work that went into her project and how utterly stunning it turned out. And that is entry number 33, Ginger Handcrafts, who knitted herself a lace wedding dress. And as you can imagine, Olga had many new challenges with this project. First, it was an all-over lace design, knitted in cobweb yarn weight, plus she used extensive beading, and she also put in garment reinforcement so the skirt has a few crochet spines to avoid sagging. But probably what was most demanding and actually very scary was designing a fitted lace dress that Olga would be very happy to wear on her wedding day. But it's breathtakingly gorgeous, and we have to just keep showing you all of her pictures because of how utterly stunning she looks. But my favourite photo is this latest one because you can see the gorgeous swish of her skirt as she's dancing. So bravo, Olga. We just totally salute your inspiring success with that dress.
That is a really brilliant piece of work.
Yeah, well done. So both winners, we're really happy to say, will receive a copy of Esther Rutter's latest book, This Golden Fleece, A Journey Through Britain's Knitted History. And these 2 books will be donated by Esther's publisher, Granta. So that's fantastic. I'm really happy for you. And just reading through the feed of the 2 winners, just to try to get a rough idea of your personalities, I think you're both going to really love this book. So I'm really, really happy for you.
Yep.
And so please personal message me on Ravelry and with your addresses, with your postal address, and the publisher will send you a copy of the book. Yay! And I have to also say, in case there's any partners sitting on the couch next to their beloved knitter, this makes a really good Christmas present.
Yeah. So you can just make a discreet note.
Yeah.
The details.
Hi, my name is Carol Feller, and I want to introduce you today to my newest book, Cozy Knits, which is a collaboration between me and 8 other designers that uses my new yarn, Nua Worsted. Now, as you can probably tell from the name, the whole theme behind the book was cozy. It was the idea of creating cozy knits on multiple levels. So first of all, the first thing that we were thinking about was cozy in terms of what you like to wear. Cozy when it's cold outside, or when the weather is raining, or it's just a miserable day. Do you want to bring a sweater out, get a nice cowl, or perhaps a blanket or a very large shawl to wrap around you? So that was the first idea behind the theme. Now, the next one is in terms of the actual knitting experience. And what do you like to knit? What do you feel comfortable to knit? What's relaxing to knit? So the kind of a combination between something that is extremely, intuitive and enjoyable to knit, but still has enough interest that it's an interesting knitting experience. And then thirdly, it was tied with the designers and what they thought was cozy, and what to them was a cozy knit, and what they liked to actually knit themselves when they were cozy. So we drew on their own personal experience and their own lives, and allowed them to create a comfort knit that was just for them. The first knit I want to introduce you to today is Comerford by Kate Heppel over here. Now, Comerford has actually got a lot of meaning for Kate because it is a pub in Ireland that she used to go to with her father when she was younger. And so it was all about coziness and being beside the fire, and it was warm inside the pub when it was cold outside. And so the actual sweater, it's knit in the round from the bottom up, and it's a cropped design, and the lace pattern yoke up here, in fact, is actually reminiscent of the flames of the fire. So she went to look for an actual stitch pattern that was similar to flames in a fire. And so you can see it's a very wearable sweater, and that one is by Kate. The next design I'd like to show you is this cowl Moyne by Emer Early. You can see here how it is a large oversized cowl. It comes in two sizes, and this is the larger size. And it uses two colours with a garter stitch stripe background and a slip stitch cable that works up over the top, just like this. So it's very relaxing to knit, and it creates a beautiful end effect. And Moyne is the Irish for peat, so very fitting with the fire theme. We're switching back to a garment again now, and this garment is called Tuckle by Louisa Harding. And as you can see, it's an extremely cozy garment, and it really is like being given a hug. So it's knit in the round from the bottom up and uses a series of knit purl chevrons, and then the yoke is circled by hearts created out of little bobble-like nubs. So it's a big, oversized, warm, cozy sweater. Louisa, to her, in wintertime, she likes to tuckle up, is what they call it in their house, under a blanket, because she has a very cold house. And so to her, this is like wearing a blanket and a big, cozy hug every winter. We're going to switch back to another accessory now, and a hat by Rachel Coopy. Hats obviously are the go-to for when you want cozy and when the weather is cold, because there's nothing beats actually having your head warm when the weather is cold to keep you cozy. This one is it's very good signature of Rachel's style, because she tends to do really interesting, dramatic, graphic features, particularly in colour work. So this is knit in the round from the bottom up, and it uses three colours. You have Bare Necessity, Chalk and Plum for these little triangle motifs. And then there is one feature motif up here in Harvest Moon that really allows you to give a little pop of colour into it. It would be a great first project for colour work. This next piece is a very versatile garment by Joan Forgione, because not only is it a vest with a cowl, but the actual cowl can come off separately. So you can opt to cool yourself down, take the cowl off, or wear it with the cowl. So it's very simple design. Most of it are garter stitch with these great big thick cable features running up the side. And it's perfect for in-between weathers. If you're new to cables, this would actually make a very good first cable, because it's just the single cable with the garter running up. Or alternatively, you could actually go ahead and just knit the cowl by itself and use it as a swatch to begin with, doing the cables and the garter gauge. This next design is actually the cover design from the book. It is the Rutland Cowl by Bristol Ivy, and it is a seriously oversized cozy cowl that is just perfect for wrapping around yourself when it's cold. Now, I actually knit a version of this myself because it's quite an interesting construction, as most of Bristol's designs usually are. It starts off with little triangles and then chevrons that go between them. So it's really a modified entrelac style is what this is knit from. But again, once you actually get into the rhythm of it, it's one that it repeats going up. So it can be creating a nice relaxing knitting project, even though the result looks much more intricate. We've come to the next garment now, and this one is mine, and it's named Ballon Temple. Now, I've got a great fondness for cardigans because I tend to get warm and cold very easily every time there's a gust of breeze. And so it made a lot of sense to me to go ahead and create a cardigan for this particular project. So it incorporates a lot of my favorite things. It's got a sideways yoke with garter stitch in short rows. So the top part is knit from side to side like this, and then uses a fairly flat cable to work along the bottom of the band. Then the rest of it is knit down with a couple of feature cables, but the rest of it done in nice relaxing garter stitch. Our next item from the book is the beautiful shawl Terrain by Jimenez Joseph. This one is designed to look like parts of the actual terrain from the countryside. So each of the stitch patterns used is to echo a different part of the country. So first of all, it starts with the center of the back, where you've got the rolling hills. And then from there, one side is picked up and you've got potholes. You've got just a repeated little larger yarn overs as potholes down one side. And then the other side has got these little drop stitch features to create field tracks. And then the whole lot of it is finished off with this ribbing, which is reminiscent of corrugated roofs that you see all over the countryside. So overall, it creates a very nice size shawl that stays well on your shoulder. We're now coming to a huge oversized shawl called Lackenduff that is created by Louise Tilbrook. Now you can actually see here that it's a very relaxing knit once you actually learn the stitch pattern. So it's got a series of small little textured panels with these wider faux cables running in between. So it's light flat cables as opposed to big thick ones. It's a beautiful long size, so you can actually wrap it comfortably around, but you could also even just drape it around your shoulders or use it as a lap blanket in cooler weather. And the actual stitch pattern is one that if you added a little extra to the side, you could create a full blanket from it. All of the projects in Cozy Knits use my brand new yarn, Newa Worsted. This is a worsted weight of the original Newa yarn, which is a blend of 60% merino, 20% yak and 20% linen. And it creates a super soft, heathery yarn. Now the combination of the rustic flecks from the linen combined with the super soft texture make it a really great yarn for all of the knits in the Cozy Knit book. Now, I hope you enjoyed my whirlwind tour of the Cozy Knits book. There are so many warm, snuggly projects that I think you're sure to find an accessory or a garment that you'll have fun knitting and will keep you cozy and warm all winter long.
So we hope you enjoyed seeing Carol again, showing all of those really gorgeous projects from her latest book, Cozy Knits. We actually did a full feature interview on Carol Feller back in episode 80. So if you haven't seen it, you should really go back and see it again.
Yeah, Carol is really good at explaining technical concepts very clearly.
Very thorough, and she does a lot of teaching through her patterns in a way. And she has knit-alongs where there's a lot of feedback and interaction. So definitely go back and see that feature interview if you haven't already. One of my favourite designs, I think, from that collection was Jimmy Knits and that was that green shawl that had the large tucks in it that were representing undulating or rolling hills. They looked so effective. It looked great in that green colour and the yarn and just the shape of the shawl so that you could really see those large tucks. I thought that was really cool.
Yep.
And the other thing, I just love what she did with the ruffle. Like it's just a large chunk, it's like a super large rib, a large chunk of pearl, a large chunk of knit. And it looked like a ruffle, but it also looked like corrugated iron,
yeah.
like what she said. So that was super cool, I thought.
It's very funky, which is what I expect from Jimmy Knits.
Yeah, she does have funky designs. Yeah. And Carol is offering a great discount for Fruity Knitting patrons. So patrons receive a 15% discount off the book and the newer worsted yarn. And the newer worsted yarn is the recommended yarn for all of the projects in the Cozy Knits book. And it comes in around 14 really stunning heathery colours. So thank you very much to Carol.
We would like to thank all of our wonderful patrons who, with their financial support, make it possible for us to produce the show. We really appreciate getting this opportunity and being able to put this material out. And if you are a regular viewer, then please do become a patron. You can do so for a really small amount each month, and it is patron support that makes the show possible. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And coming up right now is the interview you've all been waiting for with Esther Rutter. She's just charming and lovely. You'll really enjoy meeting her, and she's very knowledgeable and a great talker.
Yep.
So enjoy the interview, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yep, thanks for being with us today. Bye.
Bye.
We were pushed along by brisk winter winds. After an hour, we reached the wood at Heald Brow, ringed with a fence and topped with rusting wire. Caught in the fence's barbs were tufts of wool, silver in winter's weak light. Sheep at the bounds of their territory scratched their itches here, leaving traces of themselves on the wire. I pulled away some fibres and rolled them on my palm. Grey, black and white, the strands curled in my hand. They felt waxy against my fingers, soft and greasy with lanolin. I balled the fibres in my pocket and carried them with me like a charm. By 3:30, the gloaming began to gather in, driving us indoors. Warm and weary, I let the weather pin me to the sofa, where I looked again through my Christmas presents. Inside a paper bag with the tag "Love from Mum" were 4 balls of wool, peachy black, charcoal, dove grey and white. Banded with paper round the middle, this was Shetland heritage yarn from Jameson and Smith. And printed on the band was a line of tiny symbols: a shepherd's crook, a hand dipped in water, an iron crossed through, and my favourite, 3 tiny Shetland sheep with horns and curling fleeces staring down the crook. 3 renegades from Britain's northeastern edge, their horns a proud trumpet and a warning. I took a sniff. A strong outdoor smell, rich and greasy, caught my...
Welcome to Fruity Knitting. Joining me today is a guest whose name you may have recently seen popping up on various social media platforms, and that's because she's just published an exciting book about knitting. So Esther Rutter, who is our guest, spent a year travelling around the UK in order to write a book that explores how wool and knitting have influenced the British landscape, the culture, and even the language. And in parallel, the book is also a personal knitting diary where she knitted traditional garments like socks, a gansey and a hat to personally experience the history she was researching. I really enjoyed reading the book and it answered some of my long-standing questions. So I'm really thrilled that you've agreed to come on Fruity Knitting. So welcome.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here in Shetland with you today, Andrea.
Good. So before we actually talk about the book, I'd like to ask you how you first got interested in sheep and then knitting and other fibre crafts, because this is a really standard question, but your answer's not standard. It's quite not untypical.
Yes, well, it all started really when my father's business went bankrupt when I was 5. My family aren't a farming family, but we found ourselves living in a cottage next to a sheep farm. Mm-hmm. And in fact, this is actually how the book really starts. So I might just read a section from it to give you a flavour of it. If I see a sheep, I have to have it. These words have been a family joke since we first heard them on the doorstep of our new cottage. the greeting of a stocky, middle-aged man in corduroy trousers and a checked shirt, liberally spattered with brown matter. Walford Arnold Griffiths, the Celtic syllables of his name gave away his Welsh border roots, farmed the fields around our home and was a man obsessed by sheep. My parents were not farmers, and we had never lived on a farm before, but I soon fell in love with living there. The farm was an escape from the house, from money worries and unvoiced guilt and disappointment. As soon as we arrived, I began volunteering to help out as much as I could, a handy retreat from the times when my parents let their anger bloom into shouting. Sheep were simple in their needs. They wanted food, water, the occasional helping hand with lambing. In the farmyard uniform of wellies, grubby trousers and an old jacket, I trudged out to the fields early on dark spring mornings to stick my small hands inside lambing ewes, reaching for heads and slimy ankles to guide new life into the world. I blew warm breath into ovine lungs, got covered in ticks during shearing, and lugged around cracked buckets of mineral lick. My younger brothers and I rode on the hay wagon in high summer and scrambled up the sides of slippery straw bales. Sheep nibbled at the edges of our gardens and sometimes strayed inside it, panicking back into the fields when we ran towards them. Lammy, an orphan whom no ewe would mother, came to live on a pile of newspapers in our kitchen. Penned in by cardboard boxes and my baby brother's stairgate, Lammy was fed from a bottle, sucking the long orange teat with lusty vigour. His urine stained the kitchen lino yellow, but I loved Lammy with a child's unchecked passion. I'm not sure my parents felt the same. So yes, that was my introduction to the world of sheep, but actually the world of fibercraft I already knew a little bit about because my mother is a skilled spinner and weaver. Mm-hmm. She studied weaving at Harrogate Textile College, and there's both a spinning wheel and a loom at home. And so that really kind of caught my imagination because once we got onto the farm, I could go and pick the wool from around the fences on the farm. I could take it to Mum, she would card it and spin it, and then it would be this beautiful, soft, smooth yarn. And it seemed like magic. But the spinning wheel and the loom, of course, were far too difficult for a small child to really work. And so it was my best friend's mum who taught me to knit. She made these amazing jumpers and hats and gloves and lovely things for my best friend. And so she taught me when I was about 7.
It sounds pretty idyllic, your childhood. But what actually made you, what gave you the idea to actually write a book on the subject? And then how did you decide what format it was going to take?
Yes, so my degree actually is in English literature and language, and so I spent my degree learning how to unpick history through the words that we use and the stories that we tell. So this was kind of in my mind when after I'd spent 10 years working in literary heritage. I had worked at, for example, Robert Burns' birthplace in the Wordsworth Museum, and I was completely absorbed in telling the story of places, of people and of words. And then I gave all that up to do an admin job in university fundraising, and that lasted 3 months. And then I thought, well, I'm not enjoying this, but I am doing a lot of knitting, and actually what I want to do is read a book that tells me a bit more about the history of it, but none were in print. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, I think I could have a crack at writing that. I had the academic background and the experience of working in museums, of working with historic items. And so I thought, well, I'm going to use the approach that I studied, this way of kind of getting into our history through the words, and apply that to knitting and see where it takes me. And the other thing was that, of course, a lot of the knitting words that we use are very place-based. And so the idea of a journey just seemed like a natural extension of that.
Yeah, well, reading the book, it is really clear that you've got a love of languages. And there's some really interesting examples in the book of how our cultural history of working with wool and spinning and knitting has actually made its way into the English language. So I'd love it if you can give some examples of your favourite knitting-related words and phrases.
Absolutely. So I'll start with knitting's building blocks, knit and purl.
Yeah.
So the first written example of the word knit comes from around the 10th century, and it's actually in a Latin grammar. So you have a list of English words and then a list of Latin words, and the English word knitten, which is spelt with a C at that time, is glossed as necto, which in Latin means I bind. And then the other Old English meaning of knitting at that time is to knot. So the two meaning knit and knot are completely enmeshed at the beginning. And then purl. So pearl originally was a word for a twisted loop of fibre. And it's not until 1655 that you get pearl as in a knitting stitch used in that way. So that's quite late, really, given that knitting machines were invented in 1589. The word pearl doesn't occur in a written form until a little bit later. So yeah, it's that's just an example of how you can kind of try and chart a thing's history and knitting things through the language. But there are some really lovely dialect words as well. So as we're here on Shetland, socket. So that's a word for on a sheep where the bottoms of the sheep's legs are a different colour from the rest of them, and so it looks like they are wearing literally socks, and so they are socket.
Horses too.
Oh, is it? Yeah, okay. And then the other thing that is really...
And that's Norse, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. And there's a huge amount of Norse influence on English language and on Shetland dialect and language as well. So it's, in fact, the influence of different cultures and of different places on knitting's history is a really important part of the book. And as I said, it's really kind of what got me interested in the first place, because words like jersey, for example, we use jersey obviously to mean a jumper or a knitted fabric, but jersey is obviously a place name. And so I wanted to understand how the place Jersey had come to give its name to all these different types of knitting and knitted things. And another one, Guernsey, which some people use interchangeably with Gansey, with the fisherman's jumper. I wanted to understand a little bit more about that and how that had come to be. And worsted, today we use it as a way of describing a woven textile, but also, of course, as a way of spinning. And I wanted to understand why this tiny place in the middle of Norfolk, this is just a village, it's barely findable on a map, how it had come to be used all over the world. And it's because the East Anglia was a place where a lot of Huguenot refugees came, and they brought their amazing spinning skills with them. And so they were able to develop new ways of spinning and of weaving. And because that came from their new place, their new home, worsted, and another one is kersey. It's not a word we use so often now, but it does refer to a particular type of cloth. These place names have gone all over the world because of what was produced there.
It's amazing, isn't it? When you go back and you see them, they're tiny. They're not dead villages, but they're very tiny. They're not like what they would have been a few hundred years ago.
Certainly not compared to the rest of the landscape.
So I'd love you to talk about some of the themes in the book and the knitting projects that you chose to go with them. For example, for centuries, hand knitting was a critical contribution to many families' income. So I'd like you to talk about the stocking industry and the terrible knitters of Dent. So what were they making and how did the industry work?
Yeah, so the terrible knitters of Dent, the phrase actually was given to them by the author Robert Southey in the 1840s. He wrote a story about the terrible knitters, and terrible, as in awesome, meant amazing at that time.
They weren't terrible people.
No, they were not terrible people. They were amazing knitters. And these were families who lived in the sheep farming valleys of the Yorkshire Dales, and they were people who were using the raw material from their sheep to turn into saleable items. And I'd just like you to read it to you, a piece from the book about that. In the Dales, it wasn't just the women who knitted. They were joined by men and children to boost the family's coffers. And a good Dentdale woman could sing and knit whilst lugging her milking pail as she herded her cows, or so the old rhyme goes. She knows how to sing and to knit, and she knows how to carry the kit when she drives her kye to pasture. Keep short needles. These wise words from these daleswomen, urging folk to work as close to the tips of their pins as possible. Their language is as distinct as their knitting. Stitches were counted using the old sheep-telling numbers, yan, tan, tethera for 1, 2, 3. The thick, undyed yarn they call bump, a common praising simile of the time, was for a person to be as open as bump knitting. Striving needles competed to see who could finish their row first. So the bump knitting was actually the knitting of what were called bump stockings. Now these were specifically for seamen, and they were knitted very large and then shrunk down to be worn inside sea boots. But the stocking knitting industry was an enormous employer of people across the British Isles for centuries, because from about the 14th century right the way through to the early 20th, everybody wore stockings. Now, one area in particular where the stocking knitting was done was in the Highlands. So in the Highlands, as many of your viewers will know, a lot of people had been cleared off the land through the Highland clearances. And so there were some places there where there were kind of landlords or lairds, and people were encouraged to develop industries where they could support themselves. And one of these was the knitting of what were called Gairloch stockings, and that's what I've got here. So,
And there was a lady, wasn't
Yes.
there? Who tell us a bit about her.
So Lady Mackenzie, she was one of the Mackenzie clan from Gairloch, and they'd been landowners there for centuries. And she decided that she wanted to support the local population by encouraging them to develop their knitting skills. And she got a woman from Skye to come over to teach the women how to spin and how to knit to a high standard. And from that, they built an industry around the creation of Gairloch stockings. So these Gairloch stockings are actually kilt hose, and obviously it's in the Highlands.
I'll hold one for you.
Thank you very much.
Oopsie.
So they're long socks designed to be worn with a kilt. And like the kilt with its tartan patterns, some of the Gairloch stocking designs have this kind of crisscross tartan element to them. Others bear the symbol of the Mackenzies, so the caberfet or the stag's head, which is worked in at the garter band here. And they're knitted actually so that they're kind of inside out, and then so you can turn the tops over and wear them with the caberfet showing on the outside of the leg. Now there is no one kind of style of Gairloch stockings, as well as having the sort of the diamond pattern, the caberfet. There are also the argyle, so the kind of dice patterned stockings, and so people just develop their own, depending on their own kind of style or design based on what was saleable and what people wanted.
And then you've got the gloves here, which look very, very fine.
Yes.
So tell us a bit about them, and also tell us about the swaving of the Terrible Knitters of Dent.
Yes, so the Terrible Knitters were very, very, very skilled at working with very fine wool. So this is Jameson and Smith undyed Shetland Heritage Naturals, worked on 2mm needles. Now, when they worked, the knitters would quite often have one of the needles under the arm, and they would work onto the point.
Okay, yeah.
And they would sometimes use a knitting belt to hold this in place, or a knitting stick, and then they would kind of throw the yarn, almost a little bit like continental knitting, where you kind of you throw the yarn over, so you've got a kind of smoother, quicker style.
And you think the movement or the rocking was side to side?
Well, I don't know. It's really hard, and that is the problem with having no visual records or moving visual records. And you only have people's description. But certainly, swaving was a kind of rocking, and people would sing or they would recite whilst they were swaving and kind of keep the rhythm up. And they were incredibly fast. You had to be in order to make it pay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So these are a copy of one of the last pairs of gloves that were made by a terrible knitter, a woman called Mary Allen, who was still making things like this for sale in the 1920s. And the originals are in the Wordsworth Museum, and they were made for a woman called H. Inglis, and it's her name that's worked into the garter band, but I personalised these and put my own name in.
Oh, that's good. Okay, so you're now part of the heritage of the Terrible Knitters of Dent, aren't
Yes,
you?
I'm not sure the terrible knitters would want me in their club, but anyway, I've done it. So.
Okay, so you mentioned the Highland clearances, and it was due to large-scale sheep farming, particularly with the Cheviot breed, that led to the Highland clearances. And if you didn't know about the clearances, you would have learnt about them through the Outlander series, either the books or the movies.
Yep.
And the Highland clearances in turn led to the further development of the fishing industry, which is really interesting because all of that impacted knitting. So maybe tell us a little bit about that, particularly the fishing industry and the women.
Even before the Highland clearances of the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a little bit of a tradition of moving people away from the slightly more profitable sheep farming areas inland in the Highlands to the coast to try their hand at earning a living by fishing. And that was much harder, and it was a much more marginal way of life. And with the clearances, when some of the lairds cleared the people off the land onto the coastal community or into the kind of coastal areas.
And just in case, because we've got lots of international viewers, a laird is a landowner, isn't it? It's not a lad.
No, so not just my funny accent. Yes, so it's a landowner.
Okay, sorry, so keep going.
And when they were settled at the coast, they had to learn how to fish. They also had to rent the boat that they fished in back from the landlord who just moved them off their previous tenancy. And they had to make all the apparel that they needed for the fishing themselves. And so from this comes the tradition of Gansey knitting. So Gansey knitters, many of you will know, were the women of the families who fished, and they knitted them by hand on very long needles. So this is a 40 centimetre double pointed steel needle, And then there are lots of different ways of making ganzies depending on whereabouts in Britain you were living. But people all over use things like knitting belts. So this is actually a Shetland knitting belt. And the jury's out as to whether there's a strong Gansey knitting tradition on Shetland. But anyway, these were also used in other places, and they'd be worn around the waist with the one end tucked in like that. Now, as I said, these were made all over the British Isles, and down in Cornwall I found people using a wooden knitting sheath like this, and again wrapped around the middle with the point tucked in like that. And I found this was really helpful with a Gansey because it is so heavy. The Gansey that I made for my father weighs 1 kilo, and that is a lot of woolen yarn to be holding in your hand. So if you can support the weight of it onto this,
Definitely.
it really helps.
And Esther's going to show you her Gansey in just a minute, but before you do, just say a little bit about the women's role, because that was quite fascinating. Everyone had an incredibly hard life, and they kind of just had to buckle down together and support each other however they could, simply just to survive. And so,
in fact, I'll just read a little section from the book. Work and wait and dree your weird, or dread your fate, went the saying. But more than simply waiting, women worked hard on shore. Small lining required fishing lines a mile long, with 600 to 2,000 snids, short horsehair threads dangling from the main line. From each snid hung a hook with a shelled mussel as bait. And before each fishing trip, women baited the hooks with these fleshy lures, but carefully, for one scrape or cut from a hook could lead to blood poisoning. The lines were then coiled into skulls, wicker baskets that were carried aboard ship, and boats took at least one skull for every man on board. Women also waterproofed the fishing gear, barking the nets by dipping them in hot resin. They often sold the catch too, carrying gutted fish and creels on their backs, walking their business from house to house. It wasn't just the creels that the women carried piggyback. Beginning a sea voyage with wet feet was unthinkable, yet before the 20th century, many smaller fishing villages did not have piers. So women bore the men to the boats on their backs, walking out to where the boats lay at anchor and wading through waist-high water to deliver the men dry to their vessels. Fisher laddies need fisher lassies, went the proverb. The fisher lassie's lot was far from easy.
Yeah,
so
it's a great reminder of how lucky we have it now,
Absolutely.
and how hard just everyday life was. It's incredible. Then you knitted a Gansey, which is for your father, isn't it? So tell us a bit about how that went.
So it was a pretty tough thing to knit, really. I started with the best of intentions. I was going to do it in a month. Now, the women who knitted these for commercial sale at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries took between 6 weeks and 2 months. So I was already, setting myself up to fail.
Exactly.
But this Gansey is based on one that came from the Manx Museum on the Isle of Man. And I chose that shape because my dad raced motorcycles there, and I'd been to the Isle of Man with him as a small child. Now, the Manx Gansey has a welt here, and then it also has 2 identifying features. So it has the fisherman's initials on one side, so here are my dad's, MFR, and it also has the number of his children on the other side. And so my dad, there's 3 of us in our family, so I've got 1, 2, 3 worked in Roman numerals there. Now, the original Gansey has actually had this section replaced and the bottom of the arms replaced, and this was really normal, and it gave the Gansey a long life, and these bits were deliberately kept plain so that they could be re-knit quickly and replaced. But the main body of the Gansey is patterned, and it's patterned just in knit and purl. There's obviously no other colour. And this was the part of the Gansey that I decided to personalise for my dad, because he's a gardener. So at the bottom here, you've got a pattern known as ridge and furrow.
Yeah.
And then you've got these long dividing sections here are what's called railroad. Now, I put that in because my father's father worked on the railroads laying railway sleepers. So again, a bit of a family link there. You can see here, it's hard to tell because the pattern is actually much more easy to discern with the fingertips rather than the eye. But here we have a series of small trees for the garden, and then an apple.
Because he's a gardener.
Because he's a gardener. Yeah. And then on the other side, so this is actually the front, you've got, again, ridge and furrow. You've got tree of life, very familiar to knitters in Shetland in particular. Yeah. And then you also have a moss stitch block here. And the reason I chose my dad as the person to receive one is because as a gardener, he's out in all weathers. And that was the closest I could find to somebody who was working like a fisherman would have done back in the day. So there we go. Beautiful. Here it is.
And you've got, did you put in a net gusset or? Or just the undergarment?
Just the underarms,
yeah.
so you can see under here, you've got the wee gussets in there.
Well done, and I bet he loves it.
He does, he loves it so much he won't wear it. He thinks it's too precious to wear for work, which wasn't really the point, but there you go.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so I think the most unusual garment you knitted was a bikini. And that project was connected to the historical development of well-known brands like Pringle, Dior and Chanel. And they started their businesses with knitted undergarments. So I think we're now into the 1940s. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yes, so the Borders actually had a really vibrant history of knitting underwear. So actually stockings is where it all started, stocking frames, the machines, a bit like a small loom with a little seat on, that were powered by hand and that were actually used mostly by men because it was a physically demanding job. And then the rest of the family would be busy winding the yarn and sewing up the stockings at the back.
Yeah.
Now, from this, the Border mills were able to develop larger scale knitting machines that were capable of knitting much larger pieces and making things like combinations. So this was the underwear that people wore in the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, sort of a onesie, basically.
Like long johns.
Long johns, yeah exactly. And people would wear them for the whole winter.
Without washing them.
Without washing them, which is, you can well imagine the smell come spring. Anyway, from these combinations evolved the modern swimming costume. And it was in tandem with the development of the leisured middle classes. And as I say, in the 19th century, people had free time and they wanted to spend it doing physical things. And so by the 1930s, we've gone from the kind of all-in-one combinations through to the bikini. Named after Bikini Atoll, where the first nuclear test was done, because it was such a massive kind of shock to people to see people in two-piece swimming wear. Now, the pattern I used for this was from Practical Knitting Illustrated, which was published in 1949. So this was before bikinis and swimwear was widely available for people to buy in shops, and rationing was just coming to an end, and so people were looking to make their own things. And the pattern, I'll talk you through it. So the yarn that I used came from the Borders, from the Border Mill in Duns. It's actually a mixture of wool, alpaca, silk and bamboo. And the reason I chose that was because when I talked to people, particularly people born in, say, the 40s or the 50s, the 60s, who remembered having knitted swimwear made for them by loving family members, everyone would say, oh, but it was so itchy. And so I thought, well, modern yarns being what they can be, I want to see if actually you can have a nice soft and smooth feeling bikini. Anyway, so that gave me the yarn and the colour. Of course, this is jonquil, meaning daffodil, because everybody knows the itsy bitsy teeny weeny yellow polka dot bikini. So I used a flecked yellow yarn for this. Now, the pattern, the top or the brassiere of the bikini is woven in fancy knit. It's knitted in fancy knit, and then the edges have a piece of thick elastic going at the bottom, along the top, and then it ruches through the middle to kind of create a bandeau neck.
Okay, this looks like a twisted. Is it a twisted?
Yeah, twisted
stitch?
rib is the other name for it. Fancy rib is what the pattern calls it.
Okay,
and you start at one end, and you literally just increase and decrease and increase and decrease. So it's a fairly simple knit.
Wow. I wonder if I'll ever try one.
Well, I can recommend it. The bottoms, bikini bottoms, are a little bit different. So these you have the gusset in the middle, and you knit from the top down, and here you only have the elastic threaded through the top.
Oh yes, okay. So it's not through the whole waistband.
No, it's not through the whole waistband. So it's acting kind of like a sort of bungee to pull the tension at the top of your bum.
Okay.
And then
But that's at the front, isn't it?
No, it's actually at the back.
It's at the back.
So that's at the back. You kind of tie yourself in at the back.
Of course, in case you've got a bit of a sway back.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's
so you
quite
kind of
cute,
cinch it
actually.
in. Yeah, it's actually not. It's a pretty good silhouette because these look massive. Let's be honest. But actually, they really can be quite flattering.
Yeah.
And what they of course are is really warm. So wool can absorb 35% of its own weight in moisture before it loses any of its insulating capacity. And I found that wearing these was actually quite a lot like wearing a wetsuit. For a start, the moisture soaks in quite slowly. And it really does keep you very warm. And I tested these in Northumberland. I mean, it was June, but as anyone knows Northumberland, it's not always that warm in June. And yeah, it was really quite lovely to be in this nice warm bikini. And thanks to the elastic, it stayed up. And in fact, the only problem I had was when I got out of the water, all the tiny fibres attracted particles of sand.
Yeah.
And so it did actually become quite heavy with the weight of sand.
Yeah.
But as something to swim in, I would recommend it.
So when you were looking for your pattern, did you have a lot that you found that you could choose from, or was it really only one or two that was available?
I couldn't find that many, partly because I was trying to combine this with the history of machine knitting, and I really wanted to machine knit the bikini, but that wasn't possible. I did have a go on an old-fashioned circular machine and a modern machine, but I wasn't able to use them long enough to actually make the whole bikini. So it was by chance really, and I just happened to come across this book at the Highland Folk Museum, because they have a fantastic collection of knitwear and knitted items related to knitting, and I came across it and I thought, perfect.
So Esther is now a mum. She's got a lovely little girl, and she actually found out she was pregnant during your travels, which would have been interesting.
It was.
And so naturally you wanted to make something for the baby, and you've chosen a traditional hap, which we've got here in front of you. And the hap is connected with the story of the Borare Island sheep, which is a primitive breed. So can you tell us a bit about their history?
Absolutely. So the Borare sheep came from the island of St Kilda. Now St Kilda is right out past the main bulk of the Hebrides on Scotland's western side, and the people who lived on St Kilda requested to be evacuated from there in 1930 because life out there was so hard. Now, they weren't able to take all their sheep with them, and they left some of the sheep on the Borare stack. So a sea stack is very steeply sided, and the sheep were just left there to fend for themselves. And they were left there for nearly 50 years, because it wasn't until the 1980s when researchers at the Roslin Institute on the outskirts of Edinburgh decided that they wanted to look at these sheep and see how they had fared and look at their genetics.
Yeah.
And what they discovered was that these sheep, they took them from the island, they brought them to the Institute, that they were almost a kind of living fossil, that they had been interbred only a little with some of the Hebridean type of sheep, and otherwise they were virtually unchanged from Britain's kind of Bronze Age sheep. And as I said, they were absolutely fine looking after themselves.
Yeah.
They self-shear.
That's why they could be left alone.
Exactly.
Many sheep breeds can't be left alone. They need to be sheared just to...
Yeah, absolutely. But
Yeah.
these type don't, and they still have that natural capacity that originally all sheep would have had, where the fleece just sort of falls off. Anyway, once this breed had been studied, the sheep weren't taken back to St Kilda. They were sent to different farms across Scotland, and one of the farms that took them was on Orkney, Burnside Farm, run by Jane Cooper. And I went to visit Jane as part of my research, and she gave me this amazing gift. Not only did she give me fleece from her flock, and that is the commercially available St Kildan lace weight that Blacker Yarns spun.
Yeah.
And I've got Isle of Dun, which is the lighter colour, and Stack Lee, which is the darker one. But some of the yarn she gave me was actually the first yarn she'd ever had spun from her flock, and I used this for the central pattern, central panel
lovely.
On the hap here.
Let's open it up.
So that middle section there is all made from this first spinning of the Borare. Now it's combined. The blues are actually Jameson and Smith lace weight, so that's a mixture with Shetland and lamb's wool together to give it that kind of lovely lofty softness. And the well, it wasn't a pattern I used so much as a method. I went to Donna Smith's hap knitting class when I came to Shetland Wool Week 2 years ago, and so I worked from the edge across through the borders and then joined everything together with a middle square, and it's all knit stitches. There's no purl, and I chose these colours and this kind of this old shale pattern to be like the islands, St Kilda and Orkney and Shetland.
Yeah.
And so the whole history of the garment is told in the visuals of it.
And it's held up pretty well with wearing. And
Yeah, there are a few bits where I had to do some darning, but yes, it has held up to being mauled about by a very active little 1-year-old. So yes.
Oh, that's great. That's really great. Well, it's a pretty amazing time you've had, and just to bring the interview to a close, let's just summarise. You left your job, you travelled around and you met lots of interesting people. You probably did more knitting in that 1 year than you have done in total previously. You got pregnant and then you published a book. So how has the whole experience changed you?
Well, it's really quite a lot, but it really made me aware of how much I was a tradition bearer. I was walking in the footsteps of these other knitters, and people that I didn't know, that I otherwise would have no connection to except through the knitting.
Yeah.
And that, it was an amazing feeling, to feel that connection, not just with other people that are here today, but people who were knitting hundreds of years ago. So that was a really big thing, and it made me really value the importance of knitting economically, socially, culturally. Everywhere I looked, I found that there was knitting, and it was amazing to realise that, because I think quite often people who aren't interested in knitting say it's just knitting, and there is no such thing, as your viewers will know, as just knitting. The other thing was, it taught me that I have the capacity to learn and develop as a knitter, and that there shouldn't be anything that you shouldn't be scared to give a go.
Yeah.
Because a lot of, I didn't know how to do lace knitting, I didn't know how to do stranded colour work, and through the process of making and researching, I was able to, well, not only appreciate the skill of the people who made these historically, but also to increase my own skill. So it's made me a much more confident knitter as well.
And what about your husband? Because he's behind the scenes supporting you the whole time. How was it from his perspective?
Well, he is the lucky recipient of these kilt hose. And again, he went on.
Are you going to knit him a pair of
swimmers?
Swimmers?
Yeah.
So it could be his and hers.
Oh, we'd love that, I'm sure. I think, again, it was at first, it was through his job that I was able to stop my work and go on this amazing journey in the first instance. But he, again, got to really appreciate the time and the skill that knitting involves. And just how much of our broader history has an angle of knitting. Because, he's a well-educated guy, he's well-read, but yet there's loads of stuff that I came across in the research that he'd never heard of, and places that he barely knew existed, that were suddenly really important, really interesting. And now he comes with me to things like Shetland Wool Week and every yarn festival, and a new appreciation for it. Yeah, absolutely. And he started kind of looking at yarns and choosing things and saying, I know it'll take a long time, so only if you've got the time, but I would really like this, which is lovely to see.
Yeah, it is lovely. And I suppose, just very quickly, another thing you would have got a good feeling for is when you were measuring up your father to make his Gansey, and you're actually knitting very tight gauge, and every little stitch is important, and the energy, your own personal energy that is put into that garment that is then given away is another feeling as well, isn't it?
It is, and it's particularly in a family like mine where we're not particularly, huggy kissy. It was, the garments were acting as a proxy for our love and our affection, and every single strand of that Gansey, all 2 kilometres of it, has passed through my fingers, and so my dad is literally wrapped in my love and my time and my attention, and of course that's what every knitted garment can be. And it's one of the reasons why knitting for babies is such an important and powerful thing, because people love to wrap new life in their love.
Well, I think that's just a fantastic way to finish the interview. So I've loved listening to you. You've got so much information in your mind and also in the book, which I really enjoyed. So I can highly recommend you reading it and enjoying it as well, and learning more about knitting and the history. I love history. So thank you very much for coming on Fruity Knitting.
Not at all. It's been an absolute pleasure, Andrea.
Good. Okay, so we'll just say goodbye to the audience.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.